First, very much welcome to före, the liberal and green think tank here in Sweden, Stockholm. I'm the CEO of this think tank, and we're very happy to have all these American guests here today. The other day, or night for us Swedes, there was a debate between the vice president candidates, and the political nerds in this country was actually up all night looking at that. I'm afraid I really did that. The debate was not as polarized as we're used to see them. Pretty calm, well, nearly. Could it be that even the Americans are getting tired of constant polarization? Today, we have some guests here to answer that question. In a joint event with us, före, and the progressive think tank Arena Idé and the US Embassy here in Sweden, we would like to welcome to this discussion to see if two former members of Congress could play just as nice as the two vice president candidates did a night ago. So I leave the word to you, Jesper Bengtsson from Arena Idé. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if my microphone is on, but I think it is. It's a green. Okay, excellent. Well, I'm very glad to be here and very glad to see you. And I'm very glad to introduce the two guests tonight. Betsy Markey, former congressperson from Colorado. Scott Klug, former congressperson from Wisconsin, which is a very interesting state in these days. Please come up to the stage.
You need to be to my right.
Vill jag prata högre?
Okay, all right.
Okay, I will try to speak up a bit loud then. Maybe, I don't know if there is the microphones only for the cameras or are they for...
Are they on?
Okay, excellent. Yeah, that's good. Well, welcome. I know that you've been traveling around in Sweden for a few days and had a number of meetings. And I guess you already has picked up that Swedes are very interested in the American election.
Yes, and very educated about it.
All
yes.
right, all right. That's good to hear. Some people say that we are the 51st state when it comes to this interest, and maybe we are. Still, it will be very, very interesting to get your perspective on what's happening now. And please step forward to the microphones.
Yes.
And because
this is not a comment on you. It's the fact we've done about 7 of these today. So
we wanted to lean.
Yeah, so we're leaning. That's all.
All right, all right. Maybe we can move the table so you can kind of sit in the window.
A couch would be even better.
Okay. But tell me, and any one of you can pick up the question. But how do you view the state of the election campaign right now? Where do you think it is? How do you analyze it? Please.
Well, I would analyze it as being very close.
Yeah.
We know where, because we have an electoral college system, of course. You have to reach 270 electoral college votes to win the presidency. There are 7 key states that both parties are hyper-focused on, as you know. The other 43, like my home state of Colorado, is in the blue column, so it will vote Democrat, most likely. And so we're very, very focused on 7 states. They're what they are: Nevada, Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, all those states. That's where the candidates are spending all of their time right now. Polling has, this as of just days ago, has the candidates in a very tight race. I mean, some polls have Trump up in a couple of swing states. Kamala Harris is up, depending on the poll that you read, between 3 and 5 states, with Trump winning others, tied in some states. But they're all polls that I have seen makes it really too close to call on these 7 states, which will really decide the election. But we only have a couple of weeks left, and people are already starting to vote. So there is early voting in the United States. So when I go back tomorrow, Actually, my ballot gets mailed to me automatically in Colorado, and so I'll vote. I'll vote this weekend. Yeah.
You said Colorado is a democratic state now,
Yes.
but that has changed over the time, hasn't it?
Oh, totally. Back.
And why?
Well, about 20 years ago is when I first started getting involved in Colorado politics. I just sold my little business, and I started working for the Democratic Party, which was almost non-existent in my part of Colorado. In fact, I wasn't at the meeting, unfortunately, where I was elected chair of my county party because no one else wanted to do it. And it was really after 2000 that people got mobilized. But I would say the reason is because we were traditionally sort of the economy was based on oil and gas. And, we knew that Colorado needed to diversify. And so there was a conscious effort over the last really 20 years to really branch out into other industries where, like the biosciences, like clean tech, high tech. And I think that diversity of the economy brought a whole new group of people coming into the state. We have gained 2 electoral votes, 2 seats in Congress over the last 20 years because we keep growing so quickly. And a lot of that is younger people moving into the state.
I was in Denver in 2008 when Barack Obama was accepting the nomination.
Oh, yes. I was there too.
I recognized...
I was not.
Oh, well, that's great.
I recognized how the state, and Denver especially, I guess, recognized itself as a green state and a green community.
Right. And has really pushed that over the last decade.
Right.
Yeah.
Scott, what do you think about the state of the election right now?
I think Betsy's absolutely right. I mean, it's the interesting thing in U.S. politics is to think about realignment. So you were talking about Colorado. So if you go back when I was in politics in the 90s, Bill Clinton ran against George H. Bush. George H. Bush had come from sort of an old traditional Yankee background. His dad was a Republican senator from Connecticut. They had this gigantic mansion on a point in the Atlantic in Maine. Bill Clinton grew up in sort of a hard scrabble, tough little town in southwestern Arkansas. He was had a single mom, and his town was called Hope, which, as you might imagine, was in every other TV commercial you'd see talking about hope one way or the other. Well, today, there's no way in the world George Bush would get elected in Maine, and in Bill Clinton's home congressional district, Donald Trump got 72%. So American politics continually swirls, and I think that's the thing you have to understand. I'll give you one other example. I talked to Larry Sabato, who runs a very well-known political forecasting newsletter and talk show. I do a podcast called Lost in the Middle, America's Political Orphans, and we were talking about battlegrounds, and Larry said, battlegrounds are battlegrounds till they aren't. And so you look at states and suddenly they've changed completely. So here's the perfect example, which I think actually plays a big role in the race coming up. If you talk about California as the most democratic state in the country, most people would probably agree. Gavin Newsom, who's the California governor, got 59% in the last election. Mike DeWine, who's the governor in Ohio, got 66%. So Ohio today is more Republican than California is Democratic. Barack Obama carried Ohio in 2004. So the politics world, so it's really sort of hard to figure out where we are today and what transitions are going on. And just to talk about one demographic group to watch in this election, Arizona and Nevada are both obviously battleground states. Arizona and Nevada are both heavily Hispanic, but Hispanics are shifting fairly dramatically to the Republican Party, especially as this election gets closer. Culturally, they're Catholics and evangelicals. They don't like a lot of the rhetoric that comes out of the sort of woke wing of the Democratic Party. And they're largely service workers. So when you say, is the economy better, they remember when Biden shut the economy down during COVID and the casinos were all closed. So it's shifting in a way that always constantly happens in politics. And so Betsy comes over and joins my party, and they say, well, she's here. I'm not there anymore. Now I go to another party.
It's not going to happen. But.
Yeah. But anyway, so that'll just give you an indication, I think, of the shifts that keep going on. Yeah. And so Colorado, George Bush almost won Colorado. George Bush almost won Oregon. He wouldn't even be close today. So like I said, the only you can count on in American politics is realignment happens constantly and continually.
And how do you explain the fact that your home state, Wisconsin, is a swing state today and a battleground state? Because it didn't used to be.
No, what? No, you're wrong.
I'm wrong.
Yeah. So I grew up in my mom was an Irish Catholic Democrat, daughter of Union Railroad workers. My dad was a German Lutheran Republican, sort of Chamber of Commerce businessman. We didn't talk about theology much at dinner at night, and we didn't talk much about politics either. And so my dad used to always vote for Bill Proxmire, longstanding Democratic senator. My mom, Irish daughter of immigrants, loved Ronald Reagan. And Wisconsin's had a long history of what's called ticket splitting, which is a phenomenon Europeans don't understand. So you don't have to vote, you know, we don't have national slates of parties like you have or the Germans have or the Brits have. It's all constituency based, obviously, people tied to specific districts. But ticket splitting means you vote for a Republican governor and a Democratic senator. So in 2022, it happened in Georgia, another battleground state. Democratic senator gets reelected, Republican governor gets reelected. You look at Wisconsin, there it's a Democratic governor and a Republican senator. Happens in Nevada, happens in Arizona, happens in Kansas, happens in New Hampshire, happens in Vermont, which I think is interesting because if you're a progressive community, chances are you really know Bernie Sanders and think he's the most popular guy in Vermont. He's not. The most popular political figure in Vermont's a 4-term reelected Republican governor who drives a pickup truck to work every day and takes his dog with him. So I don't think Wisconsin's a battleground. It goes back and forth. So Trump won it in 16, Biden won it in 20. Now it's sort of a coin flip again.
Your party has changed a lot since Trump was elected the first time in 2016. How do you explain that change when that Donald Trump now has, as it looks, almost complete control of the party?
Well, most nominees have complete control of the party, and you know I'm not a Donald Trump fan by any stretch of the imagination, but he won the primaries, so I mean he's sort of driving the bus at this point. I think what's happened is again in this swirl, you see demographics move around, and the Republican Party has become much more rural, much more conservative on social issues, and much more the party of the aggrieved. By that I mean people who feel like they don't get a break in life. And I've told this story. Betsy tried to stay awake. You've heard this like 19 times at this point.
You want me to tell it? Because I know it.
So when I used to go out to schools in my congressional district, kids in Wisconsin learn government and politics when they're in 5th and 6th grade, so 10 and 11 years old. And I'd go to towns outside of Madison. So my district was Madison, which is now, when I was there, it was blue. Now it's like extraordinarily blue. But the towns outside of Madison, home of the University of Wisconsin, state capital, 55,000 students. When you go to little towns, there are 11 or 12,000 dairy farmers, small manufacturing companies. And you go talk to these kids and you'd say, do you have any questions afterwards? And with some regularity, one of the 11-year-olds would raise their hand and say, did you come in a limousine? And can I ride in it? Because that's what they see on TV, right? It's politicians, black tie, you know, getting in. There's always, you know, it's just sort of this cliche. And I think a lot of Americans bristle against the coasts. And I think that reflects a big chunk of the Republican base. You know, folks have talked about the fact Taylor Swift endorsed, the Vice President Harris. And so people said, oh, that'll help a lot. You have to appreciate what happens like when the Academy Awards are on in the U.S. and people watch it. And some Hollywood star will rail against global warming and wag his finger at the audience and the camera and then get in his private jet and fly around the world doing photo shoots. And so people see a lot of Hollywood and a lot of New York and a lot of Washington, and they don't like it.
Right. Betsy, what is the mood in the Democratic Party now? Because first, when Biden still was a candidate, he was way behind, as it looked. Maybe a lot of people hoped that Harris would quite quick get ahead of Trump, and she didn't. How does that encourage or not encourage the...
I think the dynamics have changed quite a lot, actually, within the Democratic Party and with segments of the population as well. When President Biden was, still contemplating that he was going to run and quite the particularly younger voters were, I don't really like either candidate. Why are our politicians in both parties, Trump, Biden, McConnell, Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, everyone. Why is everyone so old? It's time for a new generation to step up to leadership in the United States. And so when President Biden, I think, certainly did the right thing. I mean, he has been a stabilizing force in American politics for a long time, probably the most experienced president we have ever had. But people were itching for a new face and a younger face. And there was just so much comment on his age. And now former President Trump is kind of the old guy. So when he decided to step down and all of the elector votes that were supporting Biden went to Kamala Harris, there was a lot of excitement, particularly among younger voters, I would say, and also among women, too. Just nationwide, Harris is way up with women of all ages, and also with young people under 30. So by 30%. So I think it has re-energized the Democratic Party. It has brought in a whole new team of volunteers who are going to other states. I know lots of people in Colorado who are going to a swing state to help out, or they're writing postcards to undecided voters in swing states to really get the vote out. And you have to remember too that it's not just. There's a lot of, in Colorado, a third of our registered voters are independent or unaffiliated voters. So you've got a third Republican, a third Democrat, third unaffiliated. In Colorado, most of those unaffiliated tend to vote Democrat, but they want to be unaffiliated. And that's particularly true among younger voters as well. So I think that it actually has energized the race. But, remember, we're not talking about the country as a whole. We're talking about a minority of states. We're talking about 7 out of 50 states so even though you've got a surge of interest among women and young people who will vote, hopefully in record numbers, that's not going to matter unless they do it in those 7 states, which is really where there is a lot of that sort of culture war, too, in the United States with people, particularly, I mean, Trump is certainly up again. More men support former President Trump than women, and particularly in some of these states where there are men that are younger, maybe not college educated, see a real cultural difference, as you said, with the coasts, or people who feel like they're better than they are, they're making more money, and so a lot of discontent among that demographic, and I think that's particularly true in what you see in these swing states. So the race is really too close to call.
Yeah. The first time I traveled to the US was in 1995, and people already back then talked a lot about the polarization. It kind of started a few years before that. And every president, every elected president, every candidate since then has talked about closing that gap, and it has only grown wider. Is there any chance that the polarization might at least get a bit more handleable?
Yeah.
Well, but let me tackle that from 2 directions. Yeah. There's a difference between talking about polarization between politicians and polarization with the American public. So if you look, for example, at the debate the other night with the vice presidents, there was sort of a big sigh of relief around the country that said, hey, 2 guys who could disagree, but they did it civilly and respected each other. For some reason in politics, most recently, incivilities become a basic principle, which is wrong. I mean, you can't act that way any other way in your life. You can't do it in business. You can't do it in church. You can't go do it when you go to school for your kid's parent conference. You sure as hell can't do it at the kitchen table. I sure couldn't in my household anyway. But it's accepted in politics. I think I would argue there are 2 things driving the perception, not necessarily whether it's true, but driving the perception. The first is the destruction of the newspaper industry in the United States. And somewhere in 1994, somebody bought a used car on Craigslist, which was one of the first internet markets, right? And the classified advertising business for newspapers was destroyed in the U.S. Newspapers were where you bought a car, where you sold a car, where you bought a house, where you found a job, where you bought a dog. all kinds of things in the world. So 45% of their income vanishes overnight. And now they said, well, we'll put it up on the internet. People will still read it. Yeah, but now they don't pay for it. And so if you look, there's increasing parts in the United States where there are news deserts, where there really aren't any newspapers anymore. And I'd argue the second trend is the only people who really pay for subscriptions or pay for cable television are people who are doing it because they're passionate sports fans, or they're doing it because they're on one political extreme or the other. And so you get these cable channels now where if you look at, Fox News and at MSNBC, it's like they live in parallel universes that I chose and choose not to finish. And then when you go into social media, right, it'll take you to whichever, if you want to get reinforced on what Trump's saying, it'll take you to 18 places that do that, and conversely. So I think the sort of lack of a disciplined, nonpartisan press has been a big part of the problem and continues to be part of the problem. And I don't know how you correct that and put that genie back in the bottle. But that's, I think, they amplify the disconnection between the parties and voters because it's good business, and it just drags the system down one step, two steps, three steps further. But I would make the case that if Betsy and I sat down with folks in a diner in suburban Boston and said, let's cut an immigration deal, I bet she and I and those three folks with a cup of coffee could get it done in 15 minutes when Congress can't.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree about the impact of particularly social media with, we used to have 3 channels on television, and now you've got media outlets that, Fox News, conservatives watch, MSNBC, the more liberals watch, and there's a totally different slant. And if you're watching them all day, you're going to have a very different perspective on public policy in the United States and how Congress and other institutions are doing. But, you just look back, you mentioned 95, but I think it's really been in just the last 2-3 election cycles. Barack Obama ran against John McCain. It wasn't nearly as uncivil as it was. Or against Mitt Romney in 2012. It was with Paul Ryan on the ticket on the Republican side, it was a much different kind of debate. And after 2000, and I lost my election. I came in with the big Obama wave. Lots of Democrats were elected. There was a lot of excitement in the country for Democrats. We passed health care reform. We passed a climate change bill that died in the Senate because they thought it was too extreme. But I thought a really aggressive agenda. And the rest of the country went, whoa, and the Tea Party rose. When I lost in 2010, I lost with 63 Democrats. Our entire middle of the party was wiped out. Any candidate like me, because I was in a very conservative district, lost their seat. In fact, I was part of what they call the Blue Dog Coalition. We have different caucuses here in Sweden. It's sort of the more conservative, certainly fiscally, wing of the Democratic Party. We had 55 members when I was in office, and there's 10 left. So the middle of the party, and I know it's happened on Republican side as well. I know that there were several Republicans that voted with Barack Obama, whether it's on the health care bill or the climate bill or education reform for student loans. They all lost their jobs 2 years later because they were primaried. They were just, you're with the Democrats, you are out. And so that kind of polarization certainly has increased in U.S. politics. And because we have more extreme voices on the left and the right, it has hurt us getting things done. But that's all you hear about as well, right? You don't, the big, more controversial bills you'll hear in the media covers, the AOC or the Lauren Boebert or Marjorie Taylor Greene, and don't hear from the people who are actually doing the work of, bringing this legislation to the floor, debating it, working on some of the bills that aren't, highlighted in the media every day. So there's certainly plenty of opportunity for cross collaboration. I was on Capitol Hill a couple of months ago, and I met with one of my colleagues from Colorado, who's the assistant minority leader, and he said Hakeem Jeffries, who is the Democratic majority leader in the House, said, oh, he has a really good relationship with Mike Johnson, who is a Speaker of the House for the Republican Party. They meet every week. They talk about what's going to be on the calendar to vote on this week, and he said, we really like Mike. So there is that, but why would the press cover that? You know, it's not going to get you more clicks.
But the media is, of course, one problem, and I think you have a more polarized media. You have a more political media in the U.S. compared to Sweden, for example. If we have the same tendency here, so that's one explanation, and maybe how the parties work. But can you name one way out of this? What would that be?
One way out of the polarization?
Yeah.
I'll just, I think mention a couple of different things. I think that number one, we might be getting to a tipping point where people are getting so disgusted and turned off and just don't want to vote anymore. And we saw that, with young voters who just weren't excited about either candidate because, gosh, they're both old guys and what are they going to do? So I think that certainly brought some, difference, and excitement into the race. But culturally, too, I'm just, people are tired. I think that's one of the reasons that the vice presidential debate was as it was, because I think their marching orders, certainly with J.D. Vance, is, people are getting a little tired of the bombastic language coming out of Donald Trump. Let's tone it down a little bit. And they both did that. And, at the end of the day, those don't really matter. People are voting for the top of the ticket, but I think people are getting to the point where they're tired of it.
I'd make the case that actually there is a lot going on, but it's on the grassroots sort of growing up. There are all kinds of initiatives. If you look with folks trying to build unity coalitions, from No Labels, which actually tried to put a bipartisan ticket together with a Republican and a Democrat. I think it fizzled out because the rules of getting on ballots across the country are next to impossible for an independent run by design, because the Democrats make it hard in New York and California, and the Republicans do in Texas and Florida. So I'll disagree with you that I think you see a lot of that. There's a group that actually is called, instead of Make America Great Again, Make Dinner Great Again, and you bring Republicans and Democrats together at your house. So I think a lot of that's bubbling up. I don't think it's nearly as harshly partisan on the state level. I think governors like Betsy worked with in Colorado, and I've worked with a bunch of the governors in Wisconsin. I think it's a whole different approach than it is at the national level. But the other thing I want to say that I think is pretty fascinating, and I don't think we know what this really means yet, but independent voters are now the fastest growing registration block in a number of states. It's the fastest growing registration in Arizona. It's the fastest growing registration in Nevada. It's just about that way in Pennsylvania. And it is in New Hampshire, where they're fancier. They're unaffiliated voters, not independent voters. But that was the block who voted for Nikki Haley. So I think that's changing, and I think both of the parties, even with Harris getting in, there are not as many double haters as they were, where people didn't like either of the candidates, but there's still a significant block that are so frustrated with politics as a whole. I think there's going to be a mood afoot to try to figure out a different way to approach problems.
So I think the response is, don't lose hope in us as a country that's going to continue to be polarized. There are a lot of efforts underway. You mentioned governors. We have 50 governors. The majority of them are Republicans, but the National Governors Association, and I've gone to many of their meetings, they're a tight group of individuals. They, like the Western Governors Association, they work really closely together, Democrats and Republicans. In fact, our governor and the Republican governor of Utah go around the country giving speeches called "Let's Figure Out How to Disagree Better," and that's their theme. And you see this kind of thing bubbling up in communities as well. Let's figure out how we can talk to one another again without screaming.
It's interesting because we actually were at a large presentation with students yesterday in Melma, and one of the students preceded the question by saying, "Well, it looks like you actually like each other." She was so stunned that we could have a conversation, and there's, we'll take these pads out, and we can probably write down 20 policy things where we'd never agree on in the world, but we can also write down another 20 where we do agree on. So I think there's a lot more going on quietly that may not make the news or make TV coverage.
But will this be possible as long as Donald Trump is number one in the Republican Party?
Well, he's gone one way or the other in the next 4 years.
Yeah.
So that's the answer.
Yeah.
I mean, Trump is just sort of one of these strange figures that pop up in American history. William Jennings Bryan, early on was a big populist, and he ran 3 times in order to have a fight over the silver versus the gold standard. Huey Long was sort of this legendary governor in Louisiana who was about to run for president before he was assassinated in Louisiana by one of his own constituents. Ross Perot was sort of that way when he ran against Trump ran against Bush and ran against Clinton in '92. In Minnesota, right next to me, overrun by Scandinavians, I might point out, they elected a former professional wrestler as governor, Jesse Ventura. And the idea was this was going to be a new party that swept America. And he was probably bored within 9 days of being on the job because he really didn't want to do the hard work of being a governor. But they tried to run as sort of an independent party moving forward, and it fizzled very quickly. Tim Penny, who's a good friend of mine, a moderate Democrat from western Minnesota, tried to do it and just, he wasn't much in the wrestling ring. So I think that's an interesting trend to watch.
Yeah. I will open up to questions soon.
Good.
I will just ask
hands
one more
pop
question.
Okay.
What do you think about election results? Who will win?
I believe that Kamala Harris will win the popular vote. I feel pretty certain about saying that. Whether she can get the electoral votes needed to get to that 270 mark from the 7 swing states, I think that the jury is still out on that. It's really tough. It's really tough to say. I thought I knew who was going to win in 2016 and was very surprised, and so hesitant to say. But I do believe that she won the popular vote, and the other is really up in the air.
So I think both of us agree that the Republicans will likely take the Senate, and the House the Democrats will take the House back, which means divided government, which, since I'm a limited government guy, makes me very happy. It means they can't do a lot of other crazy things. But I do think the one thing we have to keep in mind with this sort of close vote in the Electoral College is that it's not likely to get changed. There's been some calls in some Democratic quarters to throw it out. The Electoral College actually dates from the early days of the U.S. government. They wrestled at the Constitutional Convention, and on the side of the small states was Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and they said, we got to balance this imbalance between states with large populations and small populations. And you can see that reflected in the U.S. Congress, right? The House of Representatives represents the large states. The U.S. Senate, everybody gets 2. Rhode Island, Montana, Wyoming, who hardly have any kind of population at all. And that's what the Electoral College was set out to be, an election of 50 individual states. And so that's by design. I know some Democrats would like to eliminate it.
I'm one of those Democrats who would like to eliminate it because I think it has outlived its usefulness. And one of the reasons it was started is quite frankly, the founders didn't think that the populace was able to make educated, informed decisions to make that, so that they left it to electors. And it used to be that you had the one who came in first place was the president, and the guy who came in second place was going to be vice president. We were able to change that as well. I don't see why we can't change the Electoral College, where we know that it's last couple of elections we've had one person who won the popular vote, didn't win the election, and then all of the attention, all of the visits, all of the policy positions talked about during the election are focused on those 7 states. We haven't seen Kamala Harris in Colorado. She doesn't need to come. And I think that's inherently unfair not to have one person, one vote. And I believe we should move in that direction.
I wouldn't bet on it. 2/3 of the states have to ratify it. Not happening anytime soon. So.
Yeah, and those, yes. And those sparsely populated states don't want it to happen.
But Betsy, here's the bottom line. The Democrats can win in those states if they just change some of their policies.
Well, no, I don't. I just think it's inherently unfair that my vote doesn't count as much as somebody's in Pennsylvania. That's not fair. And I just don't think it's necessary.
You sounded a bit like I heard a story in Burma when I was there once that
which isn't called Burma anymore, but go ahead.
I know. I call it Burma. I call it Burma.
Yeah.
There was a Christian church asking for permission to print Bibles, and they said, yes, you can do them. Just make it a bit more Buddhist. Okay, Erika first.
That's good.
Mick.
Oh, sorry.
No,
I'm Erika Björström, journalist, former U.S. correspondent for Swedish television. It's wonderful listening to you too. Thank you. I just have a question. I am wondering how much Trump is a phenomena or a symptom. I mean, he is an archetypical person. We can agree on that. But I'm wondering, you know, having traveled, for instance, in Virginia, I met a lot of people who were extremely disappointed in Obama and said that he promised to think about them every day and have to bring back jobs to Virginia, and he never returned. And when Trump came, you know, he, of course, got the votes. So I think it's more a question to you, Betsy. Have you, in the Democratic Party, sort of done some soul-searching in whether you let people down that are between the East and the West Coast? It's something I've been looking for. I haven't really seen it.
Yeah, you know, I know, for instance, Secretary Vilsack, who was Secretary of Agriculture under President Obama, and now Secretary of Agriculture, I think the only one, but working in both administrations under Biden, has been pushing for the party to be more focused on rural issues. And, you know, not just, you know, technology and looking at you know, healthcare reform, but what are people in some of these areas where, you know, agriculture is disappearing, you know, we have shortage of water, and how do we figure out how to reach out to these rural communities around the country that are struggling? And I think that is certainly a discussion within the Democratic Party, is how do we bring back those voters and blue collar voters that were, you know, my mother was the one who was a strong Republican, voted for Richard Nixon, you know, like fiscal conservatism. But, you know, my dad was a, you know, blue collar worker, and he voted for Democrats, and he wanted a Catholic president in JFK. And we've lost a lot of those voters as well, particularly with so much manufacturing going offshore, the rise of the, you know, of high tech, and those people who don't have those skills being left behind. So, yeah, in terms of reaching out to those rural voters, you know, how do we make sure that there are good job opportunities if you don't want to go to college and you want to go to vocational school, and how do you fund that and reach out and say, you know, Democrats did that for you. And so I think we do have some soul searching that is going on and should continue. And particularly we'll see after this election. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. You need a microphone when you ask the question.
What's the impact of NATO if Donald Trump will win the election?
Well, so I was here in 2016 doing the same presentation with another colleague other than Betsy, and it was when the Swedes were beginning to worry about Russian submarines sort of playing off the coast. So this has been coming a long time. If you talk about the law of unintended consequences, Putin invades Ukraine and then gets Finland and Sweden into NATO, which I can't imagine is what he imagined would have happened 18 months ago. I don't think the U.S. position on NATO is going to change. I think we'll stand behind Ukraine. But there's sort of two caveats that I don't know how long it is. I meant a year, 5 years, 10 years. I meant we've essentially provided a security umbrella to Europe for 75 years. That's really pretty crazy. But I think Americans understand if you don't do this in Ukraine, we learned this lesson before, then we can go to Estonia, and then we can go to Poland, and where does it finally stop? I'm delighted to see that you've joined, and I'm delighted to see that in contrast to some of your other friends, where the phone rings in Berlin and Paris, you're actually putting the amount of money on the table proportionally to make your defense sound. But I also think you have to think about back to sort of the rural communities and stuff like that, where you see a lot more folks end up in the U.S. Army because it's a volunteer army. We spent so much money and so much blood in Afghanistan and Iraq for absolutely nothing. And so I think now what really concerns lots of Americans is we've got the Middle East, we've got Ukraine, China threatening Taiwan, and it seems like a very scary world. But the last thing you need to do in a scary world is forget your friends. And you have to, and so because of our common interest in democracy and Western tradition and strategies and economic ties, I can't imagine that we'd ever walk away from Europe. But I do think, I don't agree with Trump on many things, but I think he was absolutely right trying to put the squeeze on France and Germany 4 years ago.
Yeah, I don't agree, though, with the bluster about, if you don't pay up, then, we'll just let Putin do whatever he wants to the country. And that's bluster, that's talk, but words matter. And that is very concerning, even to say something like that. It will not come to pass. I think there's certainly cooler heads in the Republican Party, and hopefully in a new administration that he would put together, and certainly with the military, to know that we need our allies more than ever. The United States, all of us, are stretched thin militarily. The defense budget has not increased. Year by year, with inflation, and we've got Europe and European Union, Ukraine, and you've got Gaza, and as you said, you got China and Taiwan, the South Seas, and how do we deploy a limited amount of resources? And everyone needs to chip in and do their part to defend all parts of the world. And I know that Kamala Harris has said that we need our alliances now more than ever, and I think a Trump administration would not leave NATO at all.
Yeah, okay. My name is Per. I'm not going to rail at the balancing of powers, because that's basically a good thing. But how or what role does the obfuscation between, the juridification of politics and the politicization of law between the institutions, what does it have to play in the polarization?
Okay.
I don't understand the question.
I don't know. I understand the question.
Why don't you say it in Swedish, and then maybe
Let's put it like this. In the Supreme Court, in the Supreme Court, the parties put like their questions there, and it's the politicization of the law. And in politics, you have legal. Do you have lawyers looking at how should we regard this question? So it's kind of a little bit of obfuscation between the levels, the politics and the law. And does that have anything?
Do you understand better?
No.
No. I mean, I think the question is about the fact that you elect lawyers. You elect people to the justice system, and you kind of...
To the justice system. Well, the Supreme Court is appointed.
Appointed. Sorry.
Yes, okay.
So it's politicized in a way.
Ah, I see what you're saying.
So has that politicization a role in the polarization? I think that was the question. Yeah.
Well, but I don't know how you'd pick them. I mean, if you didn't pick them by the president submitting them to the Senate, the only way you could do it is if they got elected, which would be worse. So, I mean, I'm not quite sure how you get out of the box.
Yeah, I mean, the reason it is that, let's just take the Supreme Court, and not the other courts. It was put in place so that you can run 8 years total as a president, and for the Supreme Court justice, and the opposition party is never happy with the Supreme Court pick of the president of the opposite party. But they're there for life. And sometimes they surprise us. There are, Souter, who was appointed by George H.W. Bush.
Right, when Robert Bork was knocked down.
Right, that he ended up voting, after a number of years with the more liberal wing of the Supreme Court. And so that was deliberate in order to have someone who is there for life so they could be free from political pressure. And I think all in all, that system works pretty well. And I don't see it impacting polarization, even though people have been upset with Trump appointees. But hey, they are who they are, and they're there. And some of them have surprised me. Yeah. Because
I think many people in Sweden are a bit surprised of how it works in the US when the people elected as judges, for example, they have a political affiliation. In Sweden, they are expected to be impartial.
Yeah.
So I think that was a part
of
the question.
Who picks them in Sweden?
Well, they are hired as employees, and they are. I don't know. There is some board, I guess. Yeah, they are appointed by the government. Yeah.
Okay, well, it's the same thing.
Same.
Yeah. The Supreme Court is the only one elected.
Appointed by the government after having been vetted by
Yeah.
outsiders.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
people have said, oh, we should, elect them, or we should have term limits for, and I actually think that the system, at least for the Supreme Court level, works pretty well. I mean, look at Chief Justice Roberts, appointee from a Republican president. Was it second Bush? Might have been second Bush. Has turned out to be, I think, very reasonable over the years. And so, I think that it works pretty well. And I don't think that issue leads to polarization.
Okay.
Thank you. Willem Engström. I'm the former president of the Swedish-British Society with a particular interest in British politics. But I'm going to sidetrack for a second. I've actually also written the book called 99 Peculiarities About American Presidents 5 years ago. However, I want to sidetrack. So, Congressman Klug, I was going to pick up what you said about the media landscape. One journalist in this country picked up in the national newspaper a couple of days ago the fact that one of the candidates, Trump, is pouring out enormous sums of money on advertising, commercials, etc. Whereas the Harris campaign is only spending a small percentage of that sum on commercials, etc., but really trying to explore different tracks to get exposed to the general audience. And my question then is really, do we see a change, a paradigm change with respect to commercials and putting money into making yourself known and trying to find alternative ways? In other words, is this whole commercial industry going through what newspapers did 30 years ago?
No, I don't think so. I mean, TV stations struggle just as much as newspapers do, which is why they're losing subscribers in record numbers. I'm not sure your facts are right, because I think the Harris campaign has raised much more money than the Republicans have.
Oh, they have.
Yeah.
Much more money.
Much more money.
As Hillary Clinton.
No, they have spent it.
Yeah,
they may be spending it on turnout. They may be spending it on voter identification. They could be spending it in other ways using the campaign rather than just on television. Television's got diminishing returns, partly because I live in a battleground state. Here's I am with my controller turning off all the political ads. Betsy probably doesn't see 2 of them just because it's not a battleground state. So I think there's a diminishing return. So somebody once described this to me, that one person slipping on a banana peel in a movie is pretty funny, but slipping on 11 banana peels doesn't get any funnier. And so I think there's a real diminishing curve to how much political advertising impacts people. Yeah, I think the race is pretty framed at this point. I don't think anybody's really out there. I think the undecided voters are still people not really thrilled with either. And so it's hard to figure out which way they'll break at the end.
But where there was a focus, I remember running, and it was all about, you got to raise enough money so you can be on TV. You have to be on TV. And now with so many people, I don't watch TV. I only get streaming services. That it's changed how you spend your money. And so it's much more, do we do Facebook ads? Do you do, you're on Twitter. And so there's a lot of other ways to get the message out. That's
do they
not
dare
TV.
to be on TikTok?
Not many, because they're not clever enough to do it.
Wow.
The better way to do it is to actually work in television before you run for office, which is what I did. So I didn't have to spend any money at all on TV.
Well, and they use influencers, and you may not agree, but Taylor Swift is an influencer, and there's other influencers that are used. Steve Curry, for instance, basketball stars. So those kinds of people are used as well to influence specific demographics that you're trying to reach. So it's a whole different landscape than just TV and radio.
Okay, we have a lot of questions waiting. I'm not sure all of you will be able to ask one, but
we can do a rule Betsy and I have done, which is we can do sort of speed dating. So maybe you can get 3 or 4 questions in a row, and each of us sort of answer them in 1 minute.
We have a group of questions there. So,
hello, my name is Robert. Thanks for sharing your insights. I don't have any particularly interesting background. I'm just interested in this stuff, and I'm a big fan of the US as well. You mentioned you had some interesting discussions around polarization and stuff like that. How much do you think it's caused by the language that politicians are using versus how much is it caused by actual differences of opinion that have arisen over the years?
Okay, let's get some more questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Over there. Send it to the woman in front of you.
Yeah, I have a question about the question, like the issue of abortion, because I think it's very hard for us Swedes to understand how that's playing out, how that issue and what role it plays in American politics.
And then next to you.
Just shortly, is there kind of education gap or education divide if you look at the background to the current situation? You just mentioned it. I'm just curious.
Just gap of how students are performing?
Or how they vote.
How students are performing in school?
Yes.
How they vote.
How they vote.
People vote.
How people vote based on educational background.
High educated, low educated, doesn't matter.
Exactly.
Right, right.
And in front of you.
Hi, my name is Oscar. I was wondering, since your political system is so fundamentally different than ours, do you think there are flaws in your system, like being having only two parties, having these kind of districts drawn out, gerrymandering and such, the electoral college, the private part of your funding, and the emphasis on trying to raise funds for yourself? These are issues that we might not have here in Sweden or in Europe for the most part. If you could redesign the system, would you redesign it, and would you admit that there might be some flaws in the way your system is currently organized?
Okay.
That was the $10,000 question.
Did you plan
it? But still, 4 questions. Very good questions, though, I must say.
You want to take a first stab?
I'll go backwards and take this one first. This is a lot of the arguments in the U.S. about polarization is whether we've made, especially the House of Representatives, too demonstrably gerrymandered by their district themselves. So if you look, I think there's only 17 congressional districts in the country out of 435 where the current member got elected that was different than the U.S. president. So in other words, Betsy would run for Congress, get reelected, but Trump would carry the congressional district. So there's very little middle left. And so I think Betsy and I would agree on this, that you have to figure out some way to stop wiring those districts so you get more diversity. What you've ended up with is our sort of hardcore left and hardcore right and very little left in the middle. And the middle is the oil. It's where everything gets done. Now, some people will say the system for the United States to improve it would be to look at a multi-party democracy. And if you look at the Republican and Democratic Party, you can sort of slice it horizontally like pieces of cake and where they go. And if you look at satisfaction in the world, where people like their political systems best, it's actually in the Nordic countries. It's Sweden and Denmark. It's also the Netherlands ends up really high. I would only point out that all of those countries have kings and queens. We sort of had a fight about that 200 years ago, and it didn't work out really well. But the problem look at multi-party democracy, if I look at Sweden and say, wow, you guys do a lot of things better than us, and it's more stable and more sort of harmonious. On the other hand, I'll point to Italy and Israel, where there are elections like every third Thursday. So I don't know that multi-party democracy just doesn't give you a different set of problems. But a lot of these things I think make sense. If I ran the world, I'd pass term limits so that members can't stay very long, because I think the longer you're in the government, the more you think like government. And I think people work best in the U.S. system if they're in the private sector than out of the private system. If you want to be a career worker for the people, go join the FBI, go join NASA, do something else. Don't be an elected official.
Yeah. I'll go ahead and answer. Well, the first one was about language versus actions. I think language matters a lot. And, I think some of this civility started before Donald Trump. I remember when President Obama was giving one of his State of the Union addresses, and Congressman Gohmert from the Republican Party stood up and said, "You lie!" And everyone was shocked. It's like, you would say that at the State of the Union address to the President of the United States? And it became more and more normalized then. There's Trump says, "Make America great again." And I see stickers all over town that said, "Make lying wrong again." Yes, let's make lying wrong again, because it is wrong, and we need to get past this. Abortion, just real quick on that. The role of abortion that has played, of course, since Roe versus Wade was overturned in the United States, women of all ages have been incredibly upset. Democrats, Republican, independent voters who say, don't mess with the decisions I make about my body. It was a determining factor in the 2022 elections. For sure, a lot of Democrats won seats because of that issue. Women mobilized. may not be as much right now, but I still think it's going to be a significant factor. And I think it's one of the reasons that women are overwhelmingly supportive of Vice President Harris during this election season. The education gap, certainly you see more, and I think that's part of the culture gap in the United States. The people who have advanced degrees and are making money tend to be a little bit more liberal in the United States, where people without a college degree struggling to make ends meet. Men, I think sort of the denigration of some of our social institutions, whether it's church going or different clubs, contributes to this factor as well. And I think those are voters that are more likely to support President Trump. And then just lastly, flaws in the system. I wish I had an answer to fundraising because it's out of control. We tried it in McCain bill, and it's almost like you take a balloon, you squeeze it in one direction, and it comes out someplace else. So it's really difficult with free speech in the United States to get around that. I wish we had a system where you could only campaign for a certain period of time, but I don't see that happening in the United States. I already mentioned redesign. I would like to see the Electoral College go away. The other thing I think would be helpful, a reform in the United States. A lot of localities are doing it right now. We do it in Colorado, Maine, Alaska, is ranked choice voting. And so I think that opens up opportunities for third and fourth party candidates to get on the ballot, and you select your first, second, third choice. Let's say if there's 3 people on your ballot of different parties, and it's really the one who gets those most of those votes would then go to a second round. And I think that, again, makes it a little bit more fair. People don't just have to vote for a Republican or Democrat, which they, have differing opinions on, but there might be a couple of other people on the ballot. So that's just one idea.
Yeah, so Betsy's hit on the education. I mean, we talked about this realignment. It's really clear with upper income voters. So the Republican Party, for example, used to have a huge base in the suburbs. In my home state of Wisconsin, there was a collection of suburbs called the WOW counties, Waukesha, Ozaukee, and Washington, that really were the Republican base in Wisconsin, aside from the rural counties. And with Trump, that's deteriorated, and it's become much more purple. The same thing holds true in the battleground state of Georgia. The Atlanta suburbs, which used to be very Republican, have now become very purple, which, interestingly, is why you see both of these states ticket split. That's going to be one of the interesting questions in the election coming up, because it's very rare. Same thing we talked about when I used Betsy's example before, for somebody in the House to get representing a different party. In the Senate, there's really only one senator, Susan Collins from Maine, who got reelected when Joe Biden got elected president. If you look at the Senate battleground, though, right now, there's a number of Democrats actually running stronger than Kamala Harris is in a lot of battleground states. So there's a 2-term Republican governor, a Democrat in Ohio, senator, who could win even if he loses, that Harris loses the state. In my home state of Wisconsin, the woman who took my place in Congress, Tammy Baldwin, is actually outpolling Harris in the state. So it'd be interesting to see if we see ticket splitting in presidential years, which you rarely ever see. I feel like we missed one of the questions.
Gerrymandering, we missed. And I think that is an issue that we need to really take a good look at. Most of the, as you know, may or may not know, after every 10 years we do a census in the United States, and depending on where people are moving to, you only have so many seats in the House of Representatives, and they get distributed based on population. Over the last 20 years, and 20 years ago, Colorado got an additional seat, from 6 to 7, and then in the last census we went from 7 to 8. So that means other states lose a seat in Congress and others gain. And when that happens, it's typically the state legislature who then draws the districts. Most of the time, many of our states are Republican dominated, and so they'll draw the lines to favor Republicans. If it's a Democratic-controlled state, they can draw the lines. So several states, and Colorado is one of them, have gone to a system where the electors are not the state legislatures, but have to be 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans. It's what we have, and 3 independent voters. And they're not elected officials, but they're responsible. They're attorneys or citizens. They're responsible for drawing the line. So I'd like to see more of that happen, so it's not a totally political process.
And people think this is a new phenomenon. Actually, the term comes from somebody who's one of the founding fathers, who was the governor of New York, whose name was Gerald Mander, and he drew a district that looked like a salamander, so eventually that collapsed into gerrymander, and that's where it came from, and that was in the 1812s. And in fact, early on, there was a district redrawn for James Madison in Virginia, so he specifically could get elected. Now a lot of officials get elected. Someday I'll tell you over beers about 2 of my classmates who both went to federal prison, but that's a long and complicated and entertaining story. But that, I think, tells you, sort of the need to clean the system up, but it's nothing really new. It's been in American politics for centuries.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have to finalize this. Maybe the discussion can continue afterwards, but I have already asked you about the election results, so I will not do that again. So one final question. When you get back to the US now, will you take part in the campaign, and in that case, how?
I am part of a group of people, and I've done this in the past, in the Senate race in Georgia, where we're not phone banking anymore. People used to phone bank and call people that hadn't voted yet to make sure they vote their ballot, but nobody answers their phone anymore. So we do postcards and say, "Hey, you haven't voted," or "Make sure you vote," and send them, but only to the swing states. So that and. I do a lot on the local level, honestly, where I support, because I think that local politics matters. So I do a lot of work with people who are running for a county commissioner, my person who's running for Congress and city council, because I think those races really matter too.
Yeah.
So I'm involved in a bipartisan group in Wisconsin and 7 other states, the same usual set, called the Defend Democracy Project. So I'm one of the co-Republican co-chairs with a former Republican Attorney General in Wisconsin, a former Democratic Senate candidate, and the former chair of the Democratic Party, essentially sending the message to Wisconsin voters that they need not worry. We just did a poll, and there's really only about 20% of the public who worries about this. Most people, I think, are pretty confident. When I go down to my Lutheran church 8 blocks away and watch my election workers spend as much time sharing banana bread with each other as the day passes on, I don't really worry there's some vast conspiracy in the basement of St. Luke's Lutheran Church.
We feel confident about that. Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.